Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of the Detour Podcast. I'm your host Dan Jones, and joined as always by four-time national road champion from Australia, Johnny Trevorrow, and the voice of cycling, Phil Liggett. Now, fellas, it's obviously a very special edition of the Detour because it's 3 years to the day of the passing of our great mate Paul Sherwen, who, what can you say about the guy? Absolute legend. And Phil. Obviously, we start with you, mate. It's obviously a sad time because everyone obviously wishes Paul was still here, but a time to reflect on how important he was as a person and what sort of imprint he has left on the sport of cycling.
Absolutely, Dan. I mean, how long have we got? 2-3 hours? Because
as long as you want, mate.
I love that. The television never tell me that. I met Paul obviously as a journalist because he was a pretty good amateur cyclist in Britain. He won all of our major one-day races, and I was invited to speak at his cycling club amateur demo, which was the Altrincham Raiden Cycling Club, and he was leaving to hopefully be a pro in France. And so I was there as guest speaker to wish him well. That was the first real known contact with Paul, to speak about him and not report on him. He went there. Within a year, he turned pro for Fiat. And so by the end of 78, he was already a pro and had ridden his first Tour de France. And during that next 10 years, and he rode 7 tours, finished 5, I got talking to him just as a friend, because the big thing was that every day on the tour, it's not like it is now. Every day on the tour, the riders rocked up like it was a local club event. You know, they just rode up on the bikes and they looked for the chuck wagon. They signed on, no paraphernalia. And Paul always got me half a slice of lemon for my breakfast off the chuck wagon that was only allowed to be visited by the riders in the tour. And he always snicked a lemon for me, a melon rather, a grapefruit. I'll get it right, a grapefruit. And which I had every morning off Paul before he started every stage of the tour until the rules changed some years later. That's my first memory. Then we built a friendship as time went on. And then, of course, when I read in a newspaper in Britain he was leaving the international pro ranks and coming back to Britain, I stopped him at the end of the stage of Paris-Nice on the Champs-Élysées, on the Promenade des Anglais. I said, "Hey, are you packing in, Paul?" And he said, "Yeah, well, I'm not packing in." He said, "I'm just going to race 2 years in Britain and then I'm finished." He said, "But I can't tell you who I'm signing for." So that's all right. I said, "What happens if I ask you to work with me on television?" He thought for about 2 or 3 seconds, and he just said, "Yeah, I'll give it a go." I said, "Okay, in which case, whoever you sign for, have it the month of July in your contract, you don't ride a bike race, just in case I can work it with the ITV and get you on television with me." And within a week, I had a phone call from an old friend, a guy called George Shaw. You may know him, John. And George said, "Listen, Phil," he said, "I've got this strange request from Paul Sherwen." I said, "What sort of request?" He says, "Well, he wants to have a clause in the contract that not to race in the month of July." I said, "So it's you then? You're signing him?" Because he wouldn't tell me. He said, "Oh, yeah." He said, yeah, it is us." He said, "Yeah, he's going to ride for Rally Banana, sponsored by the banana industry as well." I said, "Yeah." And I explained it, and he goes, "That's fine. That's absolutely fine," he said. I said, "Look, George, we'll get a logo on him on the television, AB in Vision." He said, "No, it's fine. Got to think of his future." And that was how we got together. 33 years later came the tragic news, which almost to the minute on this day, as I speak to you, was the day I had a phone call from Paul's wife, Catherine, to say, "Phil, Paul has passed away this morning." I didn't know what to say.
Going back to your story, I mean, Paul's obviously pretty smart networker, because those melons that he gave you have just came back in spades because you put the neck out. And John, that's something that you do really well, is you got to know the right bread to butter.
Exactly. It is a tough time. It's funny. It was only a couple of days ago, talking to a good mate of ours, Phil, in Cogs, Peter Coggoy.
Yes.
And it was him. He said to me, Johnny, you know that Thursday is 3 years to the day. Paul left us. I said, oh, really? And that's when I mentioned it to Dan and text you as well. Because I thought, it's hard to believe that it's 3 years. But yeah, look, I go back nearly as far. I can remember. I remember 1978. Anyway, I'm just going to say.
There's a video that you wanted me to queue up, and that was when we asked Paul and Phil their first memories of Iffy, and this was Paul's recollection of the first time he met you, John. All right, let's have a look.
I remember my big memory of Iffy is a race in Belgium at Kermis, and he'd actually crossed the line in first place, but the photo finish had been moved to give the advantage to a Belgian. It was actually a Dutch guy, Toyn van der Bunde. They finished second. I met him in the pub afterwards, still in his racing kit. I'd been changed, I'd got myself all smarted up. He was still in a racing kit.
That's John.
Having a beer, with a cigarette, and the guy just finished second, about 15 places in front of me.
He could have been
tough guy,
the biggest resulted cyclist in the world of Australian cycling because he had the talent. But he does like a beer or two.
So what are your memories of that, John? Is that a true story or what?
Yeah, it was 1978 actually, and so Paul had just turned pro, and he'd actually ridden the Tour de France just before that race.
No, he just had Echo
there, yeah. And I do remember quite well. It was an Igloo and Toyn van der Bunde. They didn't move the photo finish. Actually, it malfunctioned. It turned out I was flicked by my own DS, who was from that town, Julian Stevens, who was trying to get Van der Bunde into our team for the following year. But anyway, that's another story. That's just another Iffy story. But I do remember it well. And I went to the races sometimes with Paul because we lived not far from each other in Ghent, in Belgium. It only took me a couple of times, but then because I would get stuck in the pub and he wasn't into that, he soon found reasons not to pick me up. But anyway, that was fine. I could live with that. But yeah, look, a sensational guy and a photographic memory. The fact that he remembered all of that, like 30 odd years later, is quite staggering in all of the things that he did in cycling. I remember that. But he signed with Fiat, which had been the biggest team in the world the year before when Eddie Merckx was riding for them. But then Eddie had moved on. The Fiat team kept going that next year. So, sensational guy.
Well, Channel 7 did a tribute. Oh, you're right, Phil.
I was just going to say, if you're going to tell tales out of school, John, I remember with Paul, you're right about his memory. He doesn't forget much at all. He's a very intelligent man, or was. And I remember we were climbing, not physically, we were commentating on the race up in the Grand Bornand. It's a beautiful part of the Alps. And we were climbing the Col de Colombière. And he was describing the descent down to the finish in the town of Grand Bornand. And he says, we used to have our winter training sessions here when I was with Lara Ducino. He said, there's a fantastic bakery just round the corner. He said, I used to go out with the girl there, so we better not go in because she had a big dad. And I think we just drive past today. And those are he just remembers those sort of things.
Yeah, amazing.
Channel 7 did a tribute for Paul a couple of years ago when they were doing their Tour Down Under coverage. So I've been able to grab that off YouTube. So let's have a look.
Posh motor, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's lovely. There's only one thing I don't like about it. What's that? Keeps telling me I'm stupid. Well, cars never lie.
I think like a lot of people was just incredible shock when the news broke of Paul's passing. He is the colour, the energy and the light that life needs.
Yeah, it's actually, he's not asleep, he's pining for the fields. No, that parrot's dead.
Oh, it can be a bit of a larrikin as well, behind the scenes, especially off the camera, and just always had a smile, which I think everyone knows and saw, and he was just a bloody good bloke.
We were Siamese twins. We were joined at the hip, and we did everything together. And funnily enough, after the early years, we never talked cycling in private.
Well, everyone, if you just have a quick glance behind me, we're finally breaking down the camp at the end of the second annual Tour of Karamoja.
Paul loved Africa. and he spoke fluent Swahili. There's now a centre of excellence for the Karamoja tribe being developed in Kampala based on Paul's name. Paul got them bikes, crate loads of bikes in partnership with a friend from Canada. All the Karamoja people rode to his funeral on those bikes. And it was very, very touching. They were heartbroken because his death, here today, gone in the morning. It was too quick.
A lot of you might have wondered, what does Paul Sherwen do when the Tour de France and the Tour of Spain are finished?
The thing that stood out with Paul was the respect that he had of the athletes.
Gold medalist in London on the track. Ladies and gentlemen, Geraint Thomas.
He'd been through the ups and downs of an athlete's life, so the respect that he had was significant and really important to presenting the sport of cycling.
My memory serves me correctly, the first time the Tour de France finished up here was 1995, and it was Le 14 Juillet, Bastille Day.
People fall asleep, especially Australians, with their voices at night, on the couch. So they've become part of their household, part of their family, and I think subconsciously both their voices just connect with Australians, whether they like it or not, because that's what they listen to at night.
To beat him, Phil, is by starting the sprint ahead of him.
Unbelievable. Mark Cavendish then gets his 4th stage win and his 8th in history.
So I got to know Paul when I was a rider. Paul was always someone who would make time to come and chat if he possibly could, to catch up, and which is really hard to do for someone who's working behind the scenes in a commentary booth. Post-career, then I've been fortunate enough to sit next to Paul in commentary and learn. We saw that's what got him into... Especially at Tour Down Under, because that's the race I worked together with Phil and Paul.
I just got a great snap. I asked them, I was like, a bit of a fangirl moment. I'm like, oh, Phil and Paul, do you mind if I have a photo with the two of you last year? Because I was working with them. And they gave me a kiss on the cheek in the photo, which was really nice. So I had my podium boys. That was a good memory.
We will miss him, and Paul will remain in everyone's memory.
Well, Paul's been such an important part of the Tour Down Under for so many years. The part he's played has helped make the race what it is today.
The outpouring of love and affection since he passed, well, I was in South Africa and in a very bad communication area, driving a kilometre to the top of a hill, surrounded by giraffe or zebra, holding my computer out the window and trying to do a television or radio interview. It was completely crazy. It was surreal. I could never accept Paul was no longer going to be seen by me, and still can't.
Yeah, it's fantastic tribute there, obviously, to Paul, done by Channel 7 a couple of years ago now. And we also caught up with Stewie O'Grady earlier today. Now, John, you were meant to be doing the interview, but there was an electrical storm and more iffy internet problems. So
we got hit by a storm. You can't blame me for that one, mate. You can't.
All right,
we got hit by an electrical storm. Cut out all of the...
okay, you get a pass card, but I've had to come in at the last bit after doing the painting. So here's the interview we did with Stewie O'Grady about his memories of Paul Sherwen. Well, Stewie, if he was going to be doing these insights, but his internet's gone. So I've just finished painting, mate. Don't mind the attire. But obviously we're talking about Paul Sherwen, 3 years, sadly, since his passing. And what an amazing character, but, what sort of effect did he have on you, particularly Santos Tour Down Under and the strong links there, but, you would have had a lot to do with him over the course of your career.
Oh, 100%, Dan. I mean, I'll never, ever forget, actually, the first time I'd ever actually met Phil and Paul. It was at Paris-Roubaix on the start line, just before my first Roubaix, probably back in 95, I guess. And, at the time, there was literally no other English-speaking people around. So to come across, them at the start line and actually speak a bit of English, I was really blown away. And, the fact that they knew who I was, and you kind of had this little brief chat, and, I was one of the Anglo-Saxons that had made it, had made the journey, had jumped into the deep end and followed in the steps of many of the guys that had ridden that path before us, including Paul. I mean, himself and Phil Anderson and all those guys were a part of ACBB back in the early French days and continued on their merry journey into the professional world. And So you kind of, had a bit of kudos coming from those guys, even though they're commentators. They were fantastic bike riders in their own, in their own part. So, Paul and Phil, from day one from my professional career, they weren't commentators. They were someone that I kind of connected with, got to speak a bit of English with, and behind the scenes when we put the cameras down, it was, catching up. How's your family? How you doing? There was almost a little bit of care involved, and this certainly didn't become father figures, but they were there as a friend and someone to kind of lean on in when you're stressed out about starting your first Paris-Roubaix or your second Paris-Roubaix or your 15th Paris-Roubaix. And obviously, once you start the Tour de France, they become part of your life, especially since I've retired and have been watching the tours from the comfort of my couch. Those guys, they're in your heads all night. You're listening to them. You're falling asleep to their voices. Subconsciously, they really make their way into your mind and become part of your life. So, obviously, Phil and Paul were inseparable, and they had a special place. The Tour Down Under, many other races around them as well, but the Tour Down Under, they really enjoyed their time down here. They were very well looked after. Paul had his favourite pair of RM Williams and used to like his pastries at our bakeries and the odd drop of red wine. But, they were just a piece of cycling history, and the knowledge that obviously they both had, but the way they came across with it, it was never too in your face. It was always friendly and whenever you needed a bit of a laugh or, get out of a serious situation, Paul was there, and he's sadly missed, that's for sure.
Was one of the biggest things, I mean, Phil and Paul, obviously superstar duo, but just how genuine these guys are off camera.
Yeah, I think that's, you've nailed it. I think that's it. They're just two genuine, great people. Fantastic blokes, gentlemen, but also really funny. And behind the scenes was the funniest parts, when the cameras were put on pause, or you went away from an ad break or something. They just had the craziest one-liners. They were like a comedy couple. They were fantastic to be around, and they just livened up every moment wherever they went. The stories I've heard from the moment they came down for breakfast, where Phil had Paul running around getting his coffees, and Paul was Phil's driver. I'm not sure if everybody knew that, but Phil never. I don't think he can drive. Paul drove him everywhere and chaperoned him around and looked after him. And it was one of those duos that come along every now and then, and it's going to be extremely difficult to replicate, I think.
And last one, mate, how good is it, particularly when you do look back on your career, that their commentary is tattooed to iconic moments that you link to?
Yeah, it does make it a little bit more special, I guess. It's fantastic, when, not that I do hear it very often, but, the moment I tacked in Roubaix, for example, you hear them kind of freaking out. Where did he come from, out of the dust? And I guess you don't really appreciate those moments in time until you really do look back and get to appreciate him even more. And, he's sadly missed. He was a close friend and someone that certainly, I looked up to and I just loved being around. It's always it's pretty hard when they go at such an early age.
Yeah, there was an interview we did earlier with Stu O'Grady. Phil, obviously 3 years is gone pretty quick, but has it really cemented how much Paul meant to everyone and just his legacy?
Oh. Look, when I went to my first tour without Paul, first of all, Bob Rawle had the invidious job of sitting alongside me. My one fear was I'm going to call Bob Paul at some stage of the broadcast, but I never did. Bob and Paul were also great friends, and Bob's a crazy guy, but Paul got on so well with Bob. His opinion was awful about Bob, but when he's with Bob, he laughed his way through that. So that's the way it is. It's 33 years of memories now. It cannot, as Stu alluded to there, it cannot be replaced. It's a period of my life and everybody's life, I think, which was fantastic. We didn't actually do any rehearsals for our show. We didn't walk around together intentionally. Nothing was ever planned. We would walk out of our separate bedrooms opposite each other in a hotel at the same time without ever arranging it. That's what it was like. Or Paul at 6:30 every morning, if he always gets up immediately and makes his Kenyan coffee in the room, and he just bang on the door. Your coffee's outside, and walk back to his room. And I'd open the doors like COVID times now in a hotel here. Your coffee's outside the door, and pull it in and wear your mask. And so then we turn up together at the same time at breakfast. And Stu is right. Paul loved to drive. In fact, he was a terrible passenger, because in the early days, I used to get him to read my copy over when I actually was the driver. But I didn't drive very much on the tour because Paul, A, was a terrific driver, and B, he didn't like being a passenger. In fact, he felt quite sick if he tried to read a newspaper. So it was great for me. I used to read all the newspapers, but I never went to sleep because I would not allow Paul to drive maybe 7 hours and likely nod off. So I hated his music, though. When we got blown up in 1992 by the Basque separatists in a little village outside of San Sebastian, it was the best moment of my life. His 50 CDs got burnt out in the car. It was brilliant. All that music gone. He was heartbroken.
What are you going to say, Iffy?
Well, you can't just sort of say when you got blown up and just move on. We've got to go back. There goes that echo again. What happened when you got blown up?
Well, we obviously the ETA, as it was known, was very active at the time. They hated the French, and they decided to have a few goes at the Tour de France, which was starting in Spain in '92, which was also Olympic year in Spain. And we arrived, but we went on a boat trip. It's a 24-hour boat trip from the UK to Santander, just down the road from the start line. So I had a brand new Citroën, which is a French car, but it had British plates on it. So the French thought I was French. And when we were parked the car that night in a little tiny square, I just got in bed, and it was midnight. Remember it to perfection. I just got in bed, and a cameraman knocked on my door and said, Phil, your car's on fire. Get out now. I said, yeah, right, because they're always playing pranks. I said, yeah, right, okay, I'll see you in the morning. No, he said, well, serious, your car's on fire, and it's rolling into the hotel front lobby, and it did. And they put an incendiary device underneath my car. Unfortunately, it took out 6 Spanish cars as well, which I felt really sorry for. This 18-year-old girl. A 2CV had burned to a cinder, and I doubt very much she was going to get the money back. But the actual Basque people were simply so nice. We know who's done this, they said, and that all night they gave coffee out. We had to rearrange our whole show because I had no clothes left. They were in the car. And I remember Mick Jagger called me because Mick has a house in Blois just up the road. And I knew Mick because my mate was his road manager. And Mick offered me his wardrobe. And I said, Mick,
wow.
With all the best will in the world, mate, I don't think your wardrobe is going to make me look good on Channel 4.
You could have worn leather chaps.
Right. It was very unfortunate. We weren't the only car, of course. Over the period, they got a few cars. Organisation was very embarrassed. They loaned us a car, French, but we dodged the bullets after that. And Citroën were absolutely unbelievable. This was a brand new vehicle, less than 1,000 kilometers on the clock. And when I reported it to them, they simply said, is anybody dead? I said, no. They said, there'll be a new car when you get to Bordeaux. That was the nearest point in France after Spain. And there was, and they gave us a new car to drive around and back to England.
Wow.
So hats off to Citroën. It was a very embarrassing situation all round. And the other thing was, in the trunk of the car was my Olympic accreditation for, at the end of the games, we were transferring to the Olympic Games in Barcelona. And it burned up. And as you may know, trying to get an Olympic accreditation takes 2 years of vetting, etc. This was burned, gone. And I just told the organization of my association, which is a journalist union, French one. Within 48 hours, they came up to me and said, Phil, when you get to Barcelona, your new Olympic badge is waiting for you. Now, that's speed for you. They just wanted this problem out of the way and fast. And I went to the games, of course. Yeah, but Paul was pretty useful. Some of his clothes survived, so he was okay for a little while. But he was heartbroken his CDs had gone. Oh,
what was his favourite? What was his favourite band?
God, it's all horrible music, Dan. I don't know. It's not all horrible music, but he did like his African music, which I do too, because it's full of rhythm. And I was sorry they disappeared, but a lot of his music, he knows all. He used to talk to everybody about groups, and he knew all these players and singers. I had no clue, and still don't, by the way. You should probably just tell it.
Well, we've got a very special guest coming up, John.
Yes.
Do you want to go to a break and bring the guest in?
Yeah, well,
it's better be a good question, mate.
Well, it was just what Stewie touched on before was so right. He said they were just fantastic to be around. So whenever I was lucky enough to be around Phil and Paul, and I've been mates with you for a lot of years, but when you two are together, you're a little bit like a comedy duo. I mean, you're just one-liners, fun and games all the time. It rolled off. It was, you obviously had a special relationship because there was nothing manufactured. It's not like they were the couple, there's their TV, and then they were together for the whole Tour de France.
Yes.
So we had to dinner together. You did everything together, had breakfast together. You were really close, mate. It was beautiful.
You never had a fight. You never had a fight. I used to have a fight daily with John when I would be at the tour.
Yeah, but you see, you're Australian. We're just passive English people. But having said that, what Stewie said is absolutely right. And I can tell, and I hope Stewie watches the podcast afterwards. I can tell you, Paul thought the world of Stewie, and he was knocked out by the man's fighting spirit. He's two characters, Stewie. He's a really nice guy we've just seen. But he's a Dr. Jekyll when he gets on that bike and he rides. He rides to win. And when he got caught 200 meters from the line in the stage of the Tour de France, we were in tears. I mean, this is ridiculous. He'd been in the lead for over 200 kilometers and he got caught and he could touch the line and they passed him. I think Paul himself has always been an interesting character. We don't rehearse, as I say, but I remember walking down to a full house in a theater in Seattle in Washington, D.C., in Washington State, rather, about 10 years ago, maybe. And as we're walking down to a loud applause and a standing ovation, we hadn't even started yet. There was about 800 people in the theatre. And Paul says, what are we going to talk about then? As we're walking down to the stage, what we're going to... I just said, no bloody idea, mate, but when we get up there, we'll kill him. And once you give Paul a seed, you can sit back and listen. That's the way it is.
All right. We're going to have a quick drinks break, and on the other side, we're going to talk to another commentator superstar, Rob Hatch. You'd all know him from Eurosport. He's a man who speaks 4 languages fluently, so that's about 4 more than us, John. Quick drinks break. We'll have Rob Hatch on the other side of the break.
Look at this bike. You think it's just a bike, right? But it's not. It's a bike. 374 people are looking at. This guy, this girl, them, all looking at it. People from here, there, and wherever this is. People that are looking for a bike. Or just a piece of it. Amateurs, semi-amateurs, and pro-amateurs. This guy wants this bike, but with this crank and these bars. This could be the perfect match. But not this one. This girl has a bike to sell, and thousands of people might purchase it. Eyes on Bikes help grow small businesses. His, hers, yours, and the latest data and insights help those businesses keep moving. We are the world's #1 bike marketplace, with over 500,000 products and 900 brands, where buyers and sellers are brought together in a place where a bike is never just a bike. Bike Exchange, where the world buys, sells, learns, and rides.
Life is like a two-way street. It's about consideration and mutual respect. Roads are much the same. However you get around, walk, ride or drive, if we share our roads, we can all be safer. The Amy Gillett Foundation is Australia's peak cycling safety charity. Our mission is for safe cycling in Australia. Our vision is for 0 cyclist deaths. Over the last year, we've seen an enormous increase in people taking up cycling, whether it be for recreation, with the family, commuting, or even to start your own cycling career. We need to do more to make it safer for every cyclist. 20 cyclists every day are hospitalised and 1 cyclist is killed every 10 days on Australian roads. So, the next time you jump on your bike or hop in your car, remember to practice the 4 C's. Be courteous, calm, considerate, and conscientious. Every cyclist death is preventable, and we all deserve to get home safely. Please donate to help the Amy Gillett Foundation make the roads safer for you and for me.
Thanks again to Bike Exchange and the Amy Gillett Foundation. As we said before, we're joined by Rob Hatch, commentator extraordinaire from Eurosport. He's been with them since 2007. He's also commentated on the Olympics and Winter Olympics, and he's done everything. Rob, thanks for joining us on the Detour, mate.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is for you. I mean, I'm just this morning. It's still 8 o'clock.
I can tell by looking at you, Rob, it's pretty early for you.
We have got you up early, mate. Now, we've obviously been talking about Paul Sherwen a lot on the show today, given it's 3 years to the day since his passing. What sort of an influence is Paul Sherwen onto your fellow self?
Well, Paul and Phil will always be the voices of cycling, won't they? I mean, a lot of people who, certainly my age, years before, years after, because all of those moments that we've seen since the 80s, they'll always be there, won't they? They'll be replayed and archived, and they'll always be the voices of cycling. And obviously, all of us here are in a very privileged position to meet Paul, and in Phil's case, live his life next to him, and all the joy that he brought to everything. And I'll just always remember the first few years that I was at the Tour de France and other races, just stepping down the commentary box, and you'd always hear Paul's voice. You'd always hear it from a country mile off. And he'd just be this happy presence, and everybody, like a magnet, just around him, chatting and sharing stories. And that was the nice thing. It wasn't necessarily about the cycling. It was just about the place. And I think I've been listening to some lovely stories this morning about his love for Africa and everything. But yeah, a giant of a person, and taken too soon.
Is it refreshing when you see guys that are superstars? We were talking about this with Stewie, that are just so humble, outside of their job. Because like I had a guy, installing a TV here today, and he did an extra job for me. I thought, I'll flick him a DVD, and he said, "Oh, what's this?" And I said, "Oh, it's a all for one." And he said, "Oh, do you know Phil Liggett?" I said, "Yeah, I know Phil." And he goes, "Oh, mate, he's like my idol." I said, "Well, you know what they say, mate. You should never meet your heroes." but in this case, you should, because welfare, they're bloody just as good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about cycling, isn't it, really? Generally. As you said at the beginning, I've worked in a few different sports, and I love them all. I grew up watching the cricket. I idolised the Australian cricket commentators. They were my heroes when I was a kid, really. Watching football, did a bit of work in football, and it's true, not everybody's as nice, really. Not everybody is as nice as in cycling. And yeah, you get the odd character, let's say, but it's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to meet people like Phil and have the odd opportunity of working with him, and obviously Paul, and it is very refreshing to know that they're just simply nice people who enjoy life, want to have a good time, and want to sort of share that joy with other people, whether it's on air or off air.
Phil, is there a big community amongst cycling commentators? I mean, have you guys started your own WhatsApp group or something? I feel like if you haven't, you need to get one started.
Well, when I started, there were none, but they gradually got more of them, more and more. Nice to meet you again, Rob. And
nice to see you, Phil.
Yeah, we've watched the commentating peloton gradually grow now. There's quite a few around the world now. I think they all work for Eurosport, but there's quite a few. And it's I'm just having some more coffee once this is here. We remain a close pact, as indeed in general do all of the commentators around the world. We call them all our friends rather than colleagues that commentate. If a rider comes on screen, we just look at his nationality if we don't know him. Rob will know him, but I may not. And I'll nip down the commentary box, and I'll ask whichever nation he comes from, and I'll get a full story. And they'll do the same for me. In the early days of Mark Cavendish, they used to come and ask me, "Who is this man Cavendish?" And we'd explain he was going to be a good rider, might win a stage of the Tour de France occasionally. So I think, it's a community, and they're all doing the same job. You live as a commentator on what you say, and if you make an absolute prat of yourself, that's your last job. And that's why Paul and I used to love live television, because we always said, and this is his words, just remember, if you fuck up now, you haven't got a job tomorrow. And you say, yeah, that's absolutely right, Paul. So just remember just not to say anything like rubbish. But we, as I said earlier, we never, ever wrote a script. When I used to work with CBS in the 80s, this little girl used to come across me just for a go on, and they said, Mr. Liggett, can you just tell us what your opening lines will be? I said, I've no idea, love. It'll probably be something like hello. And then I would hear in my earpiece the producer say, just leave him alone, he's a Brit. It'll be okay when he starts talking. And that's how my life has always been throughout the world. And,
you had me at hello, Phil. You had me at hello. Rob, great to speak with you. I have heard your dulcet tones, and you mentioned at the start about Phil and Paul being the voice of cycling, but you are very much jumping on their coattails there.
Another one.
Yeah. And two of your co-commentators I know very well. Of course, Sean Kelly, I raced with Sean.
Yeah.
But you were just talking then, Dan, I think you mentioned about the commentators getting together. When I first knew Paul, back when I was racing in 78, there wasn't 10 English-speaking riders in the whole peloton.
No.
So all the English guys, speaking guys would get together. And Sean was one of those. Sean Kelly was just starting out on his brilliant career. But I remember trying to keep away from Sean because during a race, I couldn't understand him. He was hard enough to understand any time, but during a race, that mixture of Irish, French, whatever. But your other co-commentator, Magnus Backstead, who almost sounds like an Aussie for a while there.
He has an Aussie twang, doesn't he? He has an Aussie twang.
Yeah, he has an Aussie twang. And he used to come out in the early days and ride in the bike series that I was putting on, the Bay Crits, and that's where he met his lovely wife.
36 minutes in.
I got the Bay Crits in, of course.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. But he met his lovely wife during the Bay. And she was riding the Welsh team. So there you go. So,
did you have a question for Rob, John? Or do you just want to pump the
But I was just going to say, what's it like working with the two legends like that, with Sean Kelly and Magnus?
Well, it goes back to what I was just saying then about people in cycling generally being quite nice. Certainly that generation anyway, because like you say, there were, certainly in Sean's case, there weren't even 10 English-speaking bike riders out there in the international peloton at that level. So I think to make friends, it had to be humble and nice. Thankfully, Sean as character is like that anyway. I mean, you couldn't ask to meet a nicer gentleman in this world than Sean Kelly. Always calm, courteous, and he'll go to France and he'll speak his French, he'll speak Flemish. He sort of, there isn't anybody he isn't friends with, really, even old enemies on the bike. And Magnus as well. Magnus came along from Scandinavia at a later time, but again, there weren't too many people who spoke English in the peloton, even less that spoke Swedish. So he had to get around and make his friends as well. And that carried through. They're just very genuinely, very, very friendly people. And it's lovely to know that, you don't have to sort of look up in awe at these people, and you can do a proper job with them and ask them questions. They know you'll ask them some pretty, what might seem to them simple questions, because we always have to remember that we're doing it for the viewer, not the ex-bike riders or the pure fans. We've got to be inclusive, haven't we, and get everybody involved. And they understand that. And I think once they've understood broadcasting and who the audience is, that sort of nice personality comes through, doesn't it?
Now, one thing that fascinates about your story, Rob, is you've got a posh voice that you use for commentary. I read. How did that come about, and what tips can you pass on to John how to polish up his voice and add a bit more poshness to it?
Well, basically, I come from a region of England originally that has a really strong accent. I'm probably talking in some horrible hybrid now, actually, because there's a camera in front of me and a microphone on. As long as it's understood, that's fine. But yeah, we've got. I mean, I'm from a region called Lancashire, and we've got a really, really thick, broad, strong accent, which is, I always think it's lovely if you're talking to your mates, or even if you're a guest on a TV or radio show. But I thought if I want to communicate with the entire world, I can't talk in an Accrington twang, can I? It's more than a twang. It's very, very strong. I think I'm fading back into it. There you go. Then you can hear it a bit. And
that's good.
Imagine David Lloyd on the cricket. That's accurate. But if I'm going to be talking to the entire world, and a lot of people that we broadcast to, certainly on Eurosport, or if I've worked with the BBC and people like that as well, English isn't their first language. So I think it's really important in the English language more than others that we try and communicate clearly. And yeah, you know, I don't think I'd be able to talk like I was living in Buckingham Palace or anything like that, but I can't polish it up that much. But just try and be a little clearer and move it down the M6, which is like the famous motorway we've got in England. Just move it a bit further south, really, and a bit more neutral. That's the idea, anyway. And again, it's just something that happened when I had a microphone placed in front of me for the first time, and luckily somebody like that voice. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
Now, Phil, one thing I like that Eurosport do, they commentate cycling a bit like cricket. You know, there's a team of guys, so there might be like lots of two that'll come on at different times. I mean, is that something that you think that format like works really well? Because it's not a traditional format. I mean, you spend 7 hours in a commentary booth. How good would it be if someone gave you a 2-hour chop out throughout those long stages?
Well, it does happen. Don't forget that Eurosport, they sort of started the end-to-end coverage of televised cycling, and it's a long time to tell the same stories. And I don't agree with end-to-end coverage of cycling, by the way. I think it gives the wrong image of a bike race. But on the other hand, the first hour is usually pretty good. Then we all have a rest in between. I go and do the garden, come back for the last 40K. But I think it's a great idea to change the voice because that brings the viewer back into it again. And I'm all for it. I've done it, funnily enough, this August past, I did a new triathlon race in Slovakia. And it was the richest race ever held at $1.5 million in prize money. Best 36 triathletes in the world over the half Ironman distance. And we had 6 commentators. And I get restless because I can't go off and walk away because the racing over half Ironman, and it was 12 heats of 3 from each of the representing teams. Went on all day, and Eurosport took it, by the way, as well. But I had to just sit. I don't know whether you do this, Rob, but I just had to sit behind the commentators and still do the same job, listening, because you don't know what's happened while you've been away, and there's a lot of action in triathlons. Somebody will kick somebody in the face in the swim. You need to talk about it later, or they'll fall off the bike as they did. And you've got to know it's happened when you back reference it. So you've got to stay and watch it, even if you're not working. But I thought 6 was brilliant, to be honest.
Yeah, it presents a particular challenge as well as being advantageous. Obviously, as the viewer, as the listener, whoever it is, I think you want different voices as much as we might be talking about. You know, I think we all have to have I'm maybe a bit old-fashioned. I think that commentators' voices should be good voices. Maybe that's why I try to work on my own, because I think that no matter what's coming out of it, it has to be listenable, doesn't it? It has to capture the attention of somebody.
I'm told
that is pretty
asleep,
important.
Rob.
I hear that it was more competitive in the media booth at that triathlon than it was in the bike race or in the triathlon.
Well,
I don't know.
No, not really, but there were 2 anchors. I was the senior anchor, and then you get moved over for the other anchor who was Canadian and knew his stuff inside out better than me. But I'm only anchoring the experts. I had all the best triathletes in the world sat alongside me in turns. And they could do this real story of the event. But sometimes we're also training new commentators, in effect. The pundits were new to calling the triathlon, and they're not watching the monitors. And believe it or not, we had 12 monitors because there were so many heats. It was a brand new format, taking like the Ryder Golf situation where you've got 4s on greens all over the place, or pairs, whatever, and we had three triathletes up against each other, and the cameras going everywhere. And the big mistake was they didn't tell us where we gone. Sometimes you get on golf, par 3, hole number 2 or whatever, and we just went to a guy in the swim and a girl in the swim. Seconds later, we're somewhere down the road with another heat. It got very complicated, and while we're changing commentators that fast, I don't think it worked, but I think there will be changes next year. But I did enjoy it, though. Yeah.
Rob, how hard?
As a commentator, isn't it? Sorry, mate. It's difficult as a commentator, I think, not to be in control of the broadcast for all that time. I think you realise deep down that it's better for the viewer and the listener because they don't want to listen to the same bloody voice all day, do they? No matter how good it might be. I think it's much, much better for the viewer. But as the commentator, you want to make sure that you don't repeat what somebody else has said. maybe somebody's not getting something that you were getting in your head, and I'd love to be saying that right now, and it can be frustrating. But yeah, all in all, I think it's much better for the viewer that we have a little bit of rotation in there.
No, I agree with you, Rob. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Rob, how hard is it to get that chemistry where it's just fluid? You know, the lead commentator and the special comments guy, is that something that naturally develops over time, or do you have some sort of system where you got the elbow, pokes, or how does it work?
It's different with every pairing, I think. And I go back to the start of the show that I was listening to, by the way, when I got up this morning, and just to chat about how good friends Phil and Paul were. They basically talked about everything apart from cycling when they were off air. And there are very few people you can have that good a relationship with. I think if you do have that sort of relationship off air, it does come across on air. That there are little things and the little elbow barges and things like that, touching on the shoulder or hand up, whatever, looks across, because obviously you've got to be looking at the screen a lot of the time, although I do try to look across at the other commentator if I can. This is all pre-COVID, of course, because we're never in the same room anymore. But I do try and look at the other commentator if I can, because I think that, it just gives that natural sort of idea of a conversation still, doesn't it? Although it's difficult to do without looking at the screen. The interesting one has been the last 2 years. I mean, this job has changed exponentially in the last 2 years. One, because of the extra coverage that we just talked about, and two, because a lot of us aren't even anywhere near the races at all anymore. A lot of them. I haven't been to a road race since Omloop Nieuwsblad, just before the pandemic hit Europe. So we're talking nigh on 2 years. I've done 2 Giros, 2 tours, the Olympics, Paralympics, all from my house in Spain. And now I'm in London. I've just had a lovely email, by the way. I'm free to go outside now because I've tested negative. That's good.
That's good news.
I've come to this Champions League thing in London. And these last 2 rounds are the first commentaries of anything that I've actually done on site for 2 years. So it's nice to be back in a velodrome and back having those looks and giving those sort of elbow things across as well.
As we remember, Paul, Dan and John and Rob, we get in the commentary box. Working for NBC TV, we used to have the commentary box at one end, usually the end furthest away from the finish line, which wasn't very far. And to our right in the old days was Matt Keenan, who we were actually bringing into the business, and he was doing the fill-in bits before we actually went to air, when our voices were then plugged in around the world. And I used to go into the commentary box. I like to work in the commentary box, whereas Paul liked to work in the studio, which was away from the set, doing all his notes on his castles and stuff. And then he'd come in. But one day he was in there, and this music was loud like you would not believe. And so I walk in, take my coat off, I hang it up. I said, "Is there any chance you can turn that music down?" He goes, "What?" I said, "Is there any chance you can turn that music down?" He said, "I can't hear you. The music's too loud." That's how we started the day. And then I hear Matt Keenan just roar with laughter next door. And even when we're on air and we say something, I can hear Matt Keenan laughing right next door at something we've said, because we never knew what we were going to say, as I said. And Paul would just come out with something, and I'd look at him. It's like when we started talking the castles. It was a joke as far as I was concerned many years ago. I just remember flying over this chateau with no roof on it. There was no ruin. And I just said to Sherwen, and we always call each other Liggett and Sherwen, by the way. We never called each other Paul and Phil. I just said, Sherwen, I said, that chateau looks a bit in need of repair, doesn't it? Because it had no roof. And he's sitting about 14th century. And he goes, "No, it's 14th century." He said, "Louis the 18th lived there. Louis the 14th lived there, rather." I looked at him. How the hell did he know that? And that started it. People started writing in how great it was. And so then we gradually continued, of course. Then the organisation employed a woman to go around the whole race route and record every chateau and monument on the race route and bird wildlife sanctuary, and see if they could get them on the cameras. And we talked about them. And it became a very popular aspect. Because we're talking, remember, not to necessarily pure cyclists. We're talking to, in those days, probably 150 million viewers a day when we had the whole world service on our hands. And there's not that many cyclists in the world. So my favourite tale always has been Paul, if you can stop the old lady going to make the tea until the commercial break, you've done your job. And that's why we talk down a little bit to the cyclists and up to the country. And the whole coverage has changed because of it. And Paul was one of it, very much so, because he used to slip me notes and say, who are we talking to? Because we had this system where I was cut out to NBC and he was out to the world. Then the lights would go both red together, then we're together. And then we'd be told in our ears, SBS has just joined, or Australian TV. Well, not Australian, Canadian TV is now online. So I used to mention where the cyclists were, but we didn't. It sounds simple when you start, but after 6 hours, you haven't a clue. So you put a message across. Who are we talking to? In fact, it was a bit stronger than that. It was the F word was in there. and I pushed the note back. I said, I have no idea. And that's how we got on. We just laughed our way. And when his chair broke once, and all I saw was his 2 size 10 shoes high in the air and his body on the floor, and he's still commentating with his earphones and microphone. I had to look the other way because I was so bursting to laugh. It was ridiculous. He was upside down, still commentating on a monitor he couldn't see. It was hilarious. Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing that comes out of what you're saying there, Phil, and this really leads to where all the commentary is now. When you would attest to this, Rob, is in those early days when you and Paul were doing that. I got to tell you, when I first started coming on the tour, I think my first tour was 91 and back in about 97. Whenever we'd see an Aussie flag, we'd stop and interview them. And then gradually got to the stage where you couldn't do that because there were bloody Aussie flags everywhere. But the common commentary from the person who was there, the bucket list, the reason they were there is because they started watching you and Paul and fell in love with the travel log, with that story of France and the chateaus and all of that to the stage where they became cycling fans and now they're here. So I'm sure, Rob, that would have been part of, led you guys to what you do now.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I mean, like I said, I grew up in an area that was cricket, football, cycling wasn't really a thing in Lancashire when I was growing up, certainly not on the telly or anything like that, aside from the Tour de France, but living and studying abroad, living in France and Italy, falling in love with the Giro was what did it for me, and watching, people talking about different places and things. So I think it's a hugely important element. And if you're a big cycling fan like we all are, it's quite easy to lose where that audience is coming from. And you get some people on Twitter saying, "Oh, what are you talking about here? You should just be talking about the bike racing. We don't want you to talk about anything else." But there's a much bigger audience than the people on Twitter who just want to talk about bike racing, who want to know about what's happening in Verona, what's happening in Roubaix, where this comes from, why this city is called that, and as you said with your castles, what happens at that castle in 1567, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely right, Rob. When Paul and I were one day climbing up Alpe d'Huez in the car, of course, Paul, he had palpitations when he saw a Kenyan cyclist waving a flag on the side of the mountain. And he just reached across me because it was on my left and he's driving on the right. We have an English car. And he leaps across me and shouts at him in Swahili. I tell you, that Kenyan cyclist almost fell off the mountain. He was hearing Swahili in the middle of France, and Paul spoke it fluently. And the guy was just beside himself when he heard Swahili being shouted to him. I have no idea what Paul said, but I'm sure it was complimentary. And then Paul straightens up and he just burst out laughing, and he drove up Alpe d'Huez just laughing his head off. He says, the bloody guy, he said, he never understands Swahili up that mountain. And he was just fantastic. But that's the way it was. We just enjoyed ourselves.
Was the toughest day, I think it was in your documentary, Phil, when you had to commentate when the pitches just completely went out and you had a guy in your ear just feeding through what was happening in the race or whatever?
Yeah, that was in Blagnac. That was in Blagnac when we had a tremendous rainstorm. It was, there was about 8 inches of water came down in no time at all. And that was quite a while ago. It was in the 80s. And I was working for ITV at the time. Probably not, it'd be Channel 4 at the time. And then the race was approaching the finish line. It was the days of Panasonic. And we Alan Piper was on the squad. Robert Miller was in there. And it was going to be a bunch spin. And as they're in the last kilometre and a half, the canopy, we only had scaffolding in those days, not like now. The canopy got so heavy with water, the whole canopy collapsed right down the commentary box and soaked the television, not to mention the commentators, but soaked the televisions and blew them all up. And so we had no pictures at all. And I had a landline to London in those days with belt and braces, and the phone rang, and it was a guy called Brian Venner, who was a wonderful man, still is, on television. And Brian says, "We've got perfect pictures." He says, "Just keep talking. I'll tell you what's happening." Well, that was great. He said Brian didn't understand bloody cycling, and he had no idea of the cyclists. He said, "There's these chaps with blue jerseys on at the front." I thought, that must be Panasonic. They're leading out Van der Arden or somebody. So I just started commentating like that. And so much so, Paul just stepped back, you see, and stood behind me. And all the NOS and radio, the Belgian TV, all came down the thing because they'd all hung up. They were sat there doing nothing. They were off air, kilometres to go, totally off air around the world, but the world had pictures. And so they all came down to look at my monitor. And Paul says, no. He says, he hasn't got a monitor like you. He said, there's a guy in London telling me what the pictures are. And they go, what? And they buggered off, and I carried on. And Brian says, and now this is going on. And I said, and so. I just guessed it was the right riders because I hadn't a clue, and he hadn't a clue. And then in the last 50 meters or so, we could look over the balustrade, and I could call them across the line. And the accolades flowed, but we actually then got Paul off the monitor. He got down into the floodwater because the main sewage had burst, actually, and was down the street, the sewage, and it was inches deep, centimeters deep. And so Paul got out there, tiptoed to Alan Piper and said, "That was a rough day, Alan." "Mate," he said, "we're up to our axles in shit." That went out live on television, and that's what we did. But we got the story out, and we probably entertained the people back home, so it was job done. Yeah.
Well, you've definitely done that because there was a book on there talking about Liggettisms or little tidbits that you put in your commentary. Now, Rob, you've obviously been in the game for a long time now. Is there any particular race or moment that you look back of that you're most proud of when you go, you know what, I couldn't have probably called that any better? Is there a particular race or moment that you can recall?
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe the match of Van der Poel winning Amstel, but I wasn't actually on Eurosport that day. That's all over the internet somewhere. But we turned up for that particular day, not feeling great, to be honest. Not one of the races I'd best prepared or anything like that. Amstel, until that year, was always a race, because I think we'd had a few years where there weren't great finishes, and it always seemed a bit repetitive. And then that race just commentated itself, didn't it? With them coming through the groups and all that stuff, and just it was more about the emotion than actually giving out any useful information to people. I think it was more about just, oh my goodness, this has happened, and we have to try and somehow represent and purvey that feeling to everybody about how it's happened and what's happened. And I guess that one. But I mean, I think if you want to be good, then you're always sort of chipping away at something that you've done. There's always something that you've done wrong that's a bit shit that you think you could have done better.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Simon
Clark.
Clark.
To have, but
yeah.
I remember talking to Simon Clark, who ran second in that Amstel, a year or so later, and I said, just tell me about that last few kilometres, because he got caught by the group that Van der Poel was just leading, and then just jumped on the wheel. And he said, "No, I can't explain it, isn't it?" He said it was just so unbelievable to watch it all unfolding in front of us. It was just going that hard. It just was unexplainable.
That's crazy. And obviously, I mean, a lot of these sort of moments seem to have happened quite recently, because I think racing has just gone crazy, hasn't it, in the last 2 or 3 years with how it's changed, the start to finish coverage, how we watch it. And the other one has to be the time trial at the Tour de France. I'm sitting at home in my little sort of home office that I've made in the last 18 months on an island just off the coast of Spain, in an island called Mallorca, where I live. And I'm in my little sort of homemade studio, connected to the internet. I've got my sort of Richie Benaud style lip mic. I'm sitting there, you know, my neighbours can probably hear me outside of the window and stuff like that. And I've got Brad Wiggins on the line, Sean Kelly. And we're watching this thing unfold, and, you know, Roglic's helmet sort of slowly slipping behind, and and we're looking at each other on FaceTime and just going, this is happening, isn't it? This is really happening. And another moment of disbelief that you don't really prep for or anything like that, but just happens. And yeah, I think that's the other one that stands out, certainly during this new era of what we've all been doing from far.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine
is a Phil Liggettism, and it was the Tour of Tasmania. I think it was either 99 or 2000. I don't remember what year. And it's the penultimate day, and we've gone through Hobart, we're climbing Mount Wellington. I remember there was Neil Stevens, Cadell Evans, and a guy named Brendan Vesti, a Kiwi.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone else didn't, because you start climbing straight away in Hobart, right in the centre of Hobart, and it's like 14K to the top of Mount Wellington, a real mountain. So Vesti is a pretty good climber. He's got the pressure on, and then Neil Stevens, Cadell, and then Neil starts a jersey, but he's struggling a little bit. Cadell bounces past him and then just get whack. And so I'm the race director, so I'm in the front car. And the car next to me, Phil Anderson's driving, and Phil Liggett is in the passenger seat, and they're covering it for our TV. So I remember putting the foot down, and Cadell was just going that hard. I had to put the foot down again, and we accelerated away, and around the corner we go together, car side by side, and Phil Liggett turned to me and said, "Can you believe this?" I said, "Bloody hell." He said, "This kid wins Tour de France one day."
There you go.
Which he did.
The end of the story, though, was 10 years later, whenever it was. That was 98 or 99, John, wasn't it?
Yeah, 99, I think, yeah.
99, and then Cadell wins his race nearly 10 years later. Yeah. I jumped over the barriers because SBS said, "Get over and interview him, can you?" So I got out of the coverage for the Americans, jumped over the barrier, battled through, got hold of Cadell by the back of his left shoulder, pulled him round, said, "Cadell, it's me." He said, "You?" He said, "You told me I could win the Tour de France." I said, "Yes, but I didn't expect you to take so bloody long about it." It was live on SBS. Yeah.
We've got a couple of live comments. Tom Maloney obviously says, "Rip Paul, respect." Yeah. Ian Thomas says, "Paul's music gone and mixed wardrobe available. Win-win." Tom also says, "Phil and Paul cycling royalty. Phil and Trish. Now there's a royal couple." Obviously, Trish was the star from the Voice of Cycling documentary. Tom Maloney also says, "Terrific to have diversity into the commentary box, ancient buildings, etc. Now the introduction of women as well is also positive for the sport." And Benji Nason also said he's got a question for you, Rob. Have you ever had voice issues when commentating X amount of days in a row? Is that a non-issue for you?
No, it can be an issue. You can blow your voice if you get far too excited. Talking about, it goes back to what we said earlier, actually. I mean, Phil was talking about doing the world feed, the international signal that goes out to all these different TVs around the world. I've done that for a few years, especially up for the Flemish races now. Quite a few of them have been broadcast in Australia, actually. But things like the Tour of Flanders, doing them start to finish, and then there only being one or two of you, and then something happens in the middle of the race and you get too excited. Obviously, it's your own fault, but you're trying to sort of relay the excitement, and you blow your voice and you can't get to the same pitch again. The day after, you're struggling, and thankfully things like that are classics. But yeah, there have been occasions where I've struggled, particularly. I think it depends on the person, I guess, doesn't it? And how robust the voice is. Mine must be a bit weak.
Well, you'd be on the herbal teas with honey and all that sort of stuff like Celine Dion, wouldn't you?
I'm not sure I could hit her notes, to be honest, but yeah.
Now, we could talk for hours on end, and I've absolutely loved this episode for a number of reasons. But I want to ask you, as we're wrapping things up, start with you, Phil. For people listening that have a passion for, they want to go down the path of being a commentator, what do you think are the keys to making a good commentator?
Well, we're talking about Paul today, and for that I thank you guys for remembering Paul on the third anniversary of his passing. But the only first of all, when I got the job with ITV back in 1978, the presenter was a guy called Dickie Davis, who was a very famous front guy on television here, and he rang me up at the commentary box, talked to me. I couldn't believe Dickie Davis was talking to me in my very first job. And it was live. It was a big race in Crystal Palace, which I was also the organizer of. We had 88 British pros, biggest field ever assembled outside of a world championship in the UK. And he used to call everybody old son. And he said, well, old son, he said, when we gone to the break, we'll come back to you. And he said, I'll give you a big build-up. He said, just remember why you got the job. I said, well, that's the problem, Dickie. I've no idea why I got the job. Because there was no interview. Sadly, it was after the passing of my friend David Saunders. And he said, because they like you. He says, now, when that red light goes on, don't change the way you are. That's the only advice I ever had in commentating. And I passed the same advice to Paul Sherwen when we went to do our first live commentary together. I said, Paul, just remember, you're still Paul Sherwen when you start commentating. And that's the way it's always been. And we just stayed ourselves. Because people often say to me in the street, you're just the same as when you're on telly, aren't you? I said, yeah, that's right. Why should I be different? And that's the way it's always been.
So on that advice, Rob, you need to piss that Polish accent off, mate.
I was going to say, yeah.
I'm not far from you, Rob. I come from the Wirral, don't forget.
True. Yours isn't quite as broad, luckily for you.
Well, no, I never had an accent.
On the accent thing, my accent would be accepted in the UK. It would probably help me, actually. Because, you know, people want different accents. People want to sort of diversify the media, which is the right way to go about it. But it's just something I decided that I feel more comfortable doing that, and I wanted to be heard around the world. So, I mean, my general advice is to work on that voice. I mean, you have to be prepared, and you know, I mean, we'd look like right saddos if you saw how much prep work we did as well. But you know, you have to know your stuff. But if the voice isn't good, then no one's going to listen to you. So you have to work on the voice. That is at least 50% of it. And the other one is just have a lot of luck. Have a hell of a lot of luck.
Yeah, you need luck.
Anything you want to add, Iffy, before we wrap things up?
Well, I would just like to refine my voice slightly.
That sounds better already.
That's impossible for an Australian. You know that.
Yeah.
Well, I can't do much about the accent, Phil, but I can work on my pronunciation.
You haven't sneezed or coughed or wiped your nose throughout the whole show, so that is a massive improvement.
JT, if you spoke like that on television, nobody would listen because we love you the way you are.
Exactly.
Phil. I do have to work riders' names correct because the place names I'm pretty good with because I lived in Europe and I'm not too bad with those, but I do the riders, but I'm working on it. I've got Pogacar correct now, like Pogacar. So I'm working on them. All
right.
Brilliant.
Well, it's been an absolute privilege to have you guys on the show. And, you know, obviously we wanted to pay tribute to the late, great Paul Sherwen, who's been an absolute icon of the sport. And I think it's really done that because, you know, the outpouring of tributes is just going to continue and his legacy is going to continue to grow as the years go on, for sure. So thanks to Phil and thanks to Rob and obviously thanks to you, John, but you're here every week, so it doesn't matter. YouTube.com/the Detour Podcast. Like, share, subscribe. Tell your mates, and we'll be back again next Thursday. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. We'll see you again next week. Cheers, guys.
All right, people.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
This is the winning ride of the Tour de France. Bet your boots on it as Cadel Evans of Australia